Welcome back to the Saving UX podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Kriegel. Each week, I talk to UX veterans about the challenges facing our practice and what we can do to make it better. This episode is the second half of my conversation with David Dylan Thomas, author of Design for Cognitive Bias. If you missed part one, go back and listen to that first. You can find it on most major podcast networks, as well as at sux.live. That's SUX for Saving UX. There you can also find the show notes with links to lots of the things that came up during our conversation. And now, the conclusion of my conversation with David Dylan Thomas. I have no doubt that you could spend a lot of time teaching people a lot of things, but I'm guessing you get a limited period of time to spend with folks. How did you choose what you wanted to prioritize in the trainings you do, and what do these trainings look like?
Sure. So I do talks and I do workshops. The workshops is very much just based on the book. Like once I had the structure of the book down, this was a fun story. Once I had to write the book proposal for the book, right? I wrote it for A Book Apart, which by the way is the best publisher in the world. They are amazing to work with. Even just the act of going through their book proposal format helped me solidify the idea of what the book was about, who it was for. They're great folks to work with. But in creating the sample chapter, which was basically the intro, I wrote the intro for my little sample chapter, and that helped me understand the structure of, okay, we're going to talk about our users and their biases. We're going to talk about our stakeholders and their biases. And now that I've kind of softened you up a bit, we're going to talk about our biases.
You're very open about the sneaky structure there.
Right. Yeah. It's like, okay, now we got, so it's sort of like, oh yeah, users, that's so silly. Look at those biases. Oh yeah, my boss. Look at those biases. Oh, right. I have biases too. Okay, let's do the work, you know. So it's like therapy, right? But yeah, and that's really where the bulk of the workshop sits and lives. Like it builds up to almost the entire, like whether it's a full day or half day. The second half almost is just devoted to let's do some red team, blue team, let's do some assumption audits, let's go through the work and basically help you understand what it is like to do an inclusive design process, to actually work with these biases in a way that allows you to recognize them, mitigate them, see the bad road ahead coming, even maybe have a little fun with seeing the bad road coming. Like we do a Black Mirror exercise where I give you a hypothetical product and you sort of tell a Black Mirror story about it to kind of help you think about the impacts in a way that you might not otherwise think about. So all of that. So I decided what needed to be in there based really on a couple of concepts. One, just what's in the book, like to give it a structure. Because the workshop follows the same structure of user biases, then stakeholder biases, then our biases. But then also, like I give homework, right? And I credit folks like Phil Sharon I used to work with for helping me think this part of it through. But to say, okay, now that you're done, here's something that you can start doing tomorrow, right? So it's sort of like, hey, I want you to write an email to yourself saying all the things you want to remember from this 3 months from now, 6 months from now, and a year from now. But then I have these very specific, okay, now that you've done an exercise where you ask who's in the room when we begin this project and who's not in the room and how are we going to include those perspectives, like I want you to tell me now, write down how are you going to make time and budget for that going forward, right? Or we do this red team, blue team practice where it's like bringing in an outside team to critique, right, the design at a kind of ethical or bias level. Okay, tell me how you're going to make time and budget for that going forward. And I'm very specific about that because the budget piece of it is crucial. At least anywhere I've worked, if it's not in the budget, it doesn't exist. So finding ways to get it into the budget that we are going to do an assumption audit, we are going to do a red team, blue team, like that, get that into the budget template, you're done, right? Because no one questions it after that, right? It ends up happening. But deciding to put that in there was me saying, okay, I don't just want you to go on vacation and be kind of an inclusive design tourist and then forget about it when you get back to work the next day. I want it to be, no, you now know what it's like to do an assumption audit. Now you have the choice to decide to do it on your next project, and you know that it costs you nothing but time, which is not nothing, but you know how much time, you know how to do it, and you can play with it now. And you can decide whether you want to, like, but it's literally something you can do the very next day if you wanted to. Take any project you're working on that you were working on before you did the workshop. After the workshop, you can say, okay, let's bring in the team who's working on project X. All right, let's sit down for an hour and talk about our identity, who isn't in the room, what might we do to include those folks, like do a power map, like all of those are things you can do literally the next day if you want to. So I was very conscious of wanting it to be not just like inclusive design tourism, but no, here is a tool and you can choose to use this tool literally right after I end this Zoom call if you want.
I imagine you must get into some difficult places, either with, especially when you get to that point of people examining their own biases, or folks who have been on, like I said, on the business end of bad design. As a facilitator, how do you have to manage those, manage people through those difficult parts?
It's interesting. I found it's better when I step back. Like I've tried it both ways where I kind of like, because what basically happens is I present some kind of design challenge. And then people go into breakout rooms and smaller groups and discuss that challenge and come back with, their answer or their exploration. And I've tried it both ways where I kind of like just send them to the room and just leave them alone. And I've tried it where like I kind of go into the room and kind of observe. It usually goes better if I just stay out, like I found. And I think, and again, I think there's some self-selection going on where people signing up for an inclusive design workshop kind of know going in, okay, we're going to get into it. And I prepare them for that at the beginning. I say, look, we're going to be talking about policing. We're going to be talking about identity. Like if at any point you're like, whoa, I got to take a break, do. Like if you want to say, hey, I don't want to do that exercise, that's totally cool. The workshop is here for you. You are not here for the workshop. But I honestly, people, for the most part, really dig into these things. Like I'll, full disclosure right here on the podcast, I'll tell you, spoiler alert, we have an exercise where you have to come up with, there's a premise that the Camden Police Department gets defunded. And you are on a team that has to decide what the metrics are going to be for whatever takes its place, right? And that comes after I've talked a lot about moral hazard of gameplay and how goal setting has all these biases inherent to it and how to try to avoid those, because you can easily set a goal and then say, here's a metric that has nothing to do with the goal and it's in fact against the goal. So I kind of throw you in the deep end and say, okay, here, if you can come up with a metric that doesn't actually cause harm for this, you can probably do it for your intranet or whatever it is you're actually working on, after this. And that was one of those, like when we were designing the workshop, I had some help from some folks at Think. I was asking for input saying, hey, is this too far? Is this too much? Because this is a lot. And we talked about it. And then finally we came to this point of like, if you're signing up for an inclusive design workshop, I think you kind of have to go there. Like, I think you're kind of being disingenuous by saying, okay, we're going to do inclusive design, but like really gentle inclusive design. like it's inclusive, but I only want you to come up with a goal for this intranet. And like, that's fine, right? It's like, no, we kind of have to go there. And for the most part, by far, people, rather than balking at it, like I've had maybe one person balk at that the entire time. For the most part, I even go so far as to say that the more tech intensive the folks I'm working with are, like they're doing straight up product design, the more they're like, okay, yeah, let's get into it. Let's do this. And I'm like, okay, awesome. And that one in particular, I see everything from, okay, we talked about what the goals might be, but we didn't really get much further, to, oh, here's a list of 3 metrics that we think would be perfect for, and this is like, they have like 10 to 20 minutes to figure this out. Like, that's the other thing. Like, the amount of stuff people can get done in a very short amount of time is amazing. But that was something that I decided needed to be in there, is to say, I want you to have the experience of talking about these things in a very specific context. So not just open floor, hey, what do you think about Chauvin? It's more, okay, I want you to think about, from a design perspective, what does it mean to set a goal in a context that could cause a great deal of harm? Because that really is the thing I want you to be good at. Because I don't know what challenges you as a designer. Even if I'm working with a company that does like paper clips, and I think, oh, paper clips can never cause harm, I don't know where that person's going to work next. I also don't know for sure that paper clips aren't going to cause harm. Like, I don't take anything for granted, right? But I want you to be good at thinking about goals and metrics in the context of things that could really cause harm, especially if you set the wrong metrics. And that's, not for nothing, if Facebook had decided on a different business model, or Twitter had decided on a different business model, which means different goals and different metrics, you'd see a very different world today. So it's a serious skill that I would love people to get even 1% better at.
Yeah. I love how you talked about setting that ground rule, allowing people to step out if they're not comfortable. I'm curious, are there any other anything else you do to kind of help create the space where these difficult conversations can happen?
Yeah, there's a couple things, and again, like I added that. Like I said, there's like maybe one person who's ever balked, and like I'm one of those people like I can get like 10 good reviews, and if there's one bad review, I'm like, oh shit, I have to change everything. So I changed some stuff up after I got like that one bad review or one or two bad reviews, and I was like, okay, let me see if I can do something to address this at least in some part. And I did sort of create that language so that it wasn't like assumed. I basically didn't want people to assume, okay, Teach said to do this, I guess we got to do it. It's like, okay, no. The relationship I want you to have with this workshop is it is here to serve you. It's a menu. Take what you like. The Luna Jimenez Institute, I did a great work. I took a great workshop from them. Highly recommend their work. And that was kind of like their approach. It's like, I'm going to give you a menu, a sampler, a tasting menu, and you pick what you want from this. And whatever you don't want, you don't engage with, right? But you take what you want. So I want it to be like that, kind of like, here, I'm gonna lay out the spread for you. And if you want to take a bite of this, take a bite of that, great. But you don't have to eat everything if you don't want to. So that I tried to make that relationship clear, explicit. Like in my brain, it was implicit, but like I knew I needed to make that more explicit. But another thing I did was to sort of give people tools going into the breakout room to make it easier to get out of their comfort zone, because part of the work is getting out of your comfort zone. And I'm trying to give you some guidelines. And so I do this thing I've had for a while now, called the 3 Rules of Productive Discourse. And one is, why is it I always, when I actually want to say these, like I cannot remember them. And I've done them like a million times. But the first one is, number one, neither of us has the answer, right? Which is to say, you're going to enter into this conversation not having the full picture. And we agree, none of us actually has the answer, which is an implicit agreement that we're all going to learn something by the time this was over. Right? We're here to learn, not to project, right? 2, neither of us will win, right? We're not going to win the breakout room. We're not going to win the discussion. That's not what we're here to do. This isn't a competition. And winning isn't actually going to help. It might make one of us feel better until the problem raises its head again because we were too busy winning to solve it. But no, we're not here to win. We're just going to enjoy each other's company and talk about it. And we're going to explore this thing. And then 3, we're here to create something new. Right? And it's this idea that we're going to bring out the best in each other. And there is, in fact, a best to bring out in each other, right? So it's this, work the problem, not each other kind of ground setting I want to do before people start talking about things like policing or identity. And I like this phrase, I forget who said it, but I like this phrase of, rather than talk about safe spaces, because there really is no such thing, let's talk about brave spaces. So how can I give you what you need to be as brave as you possibly can be in this space, rather than try to guarantee some kind of safety that I have no power to guarantee? And I think that's also what I'm trying to set up, is say, like, if we can at least agree to these ground rules, the likelihood or the room we're creating for people to be brave and not feel judged and not be on guard because we're here to attack each other increases, hopefully. So those are the other kinds of things I try to set up to give people the room to maneuver, to start to maybe edge a little bit out of their comfort zones and talk about things that they usually, because often these are people in rooms with their coworkers, or maybe even if the company's big enough, people they've never met who work at the same company. In fact, I try to mix it up so that people from the same department aren't in the same breakout room. So it takes some bravery to say, okay, let's talk about policing with this person from this, who may in fact be the superior in another department that I haven't even met yet. Okay, let's do this. It's like I have to make some room for that. But weirdly, once I've made that room, it's better if I don't jump in. I just let that conversation happen. And people tend to be really, really great about that.
You talk about, you gave the example of paper clips. But I wonder, or do you see a difference in some of these more obvious domains where we've shown that there is harm, whether it's social media, policing, immigration, healthcare, law, financial service? There's a lot of places where we've seen lots of harm happen, so we're a little bit more aware that we have to take care in those spaces. But I imagine there's other spaces we just haven't figured out what harm is being caused. So when it's less obvious, how can people look at the work to think what might be the less obvious things that they should be mindful of in those spaces where we haven't discovered the harm yet?
Sure. I think that, honestly, the first place my mind goes is employment. Let's say you make paper clips. If you look around the office and everyone is white, Okay, you have an inclusivity problem. Whether the paper clips are serving white people or black people better, you, the company, has an inclusivity problem. And there's things you are missing because you do not have a diverse workforce. There is a group of people who are not benefiting from your employment because you do not have a diverse workforce. So there's already a way in which you are existing in society as part of the problem, not part of the solution. Like, not to put too fine a point on it. And if you're in a building at the paperclip company and ask yourself, okay, who cleans this building? Right? Is it some third party that we contract with? Okay, do the people who clean this office and in fact help us do our jobs? Because you ever try working in a dirty office, right? Are they getting the same benefits as the people who are, doing our billing? Probably not, especially if they're a third party. If they're a third party outsource, the odds of them treating their workers well are not awesome because that's how they're making their margin. And I base that example on a friend of mine, Will Reynolds, who runs Sear Interactive. And he got to the point where he actually had his cleaning staff, like his custodial staff, he brought them on as full-time employees, right? They used to be contracted with a third party, he brought them as full-time employees, which means they get all the benefits that all the other, it is a game changer for those employees, right? It is giving them opportunities that they have not had for generations. So to me, even if the actual product you are creating, and it's funny how these conversations really end up being labor conversations and not so much design conversations, but even if the product you're making doesn't even have the potential to cause harm, the way you make it can cause great harm or great good. So I think that even if the product itself does not inherently seem like it could be having these downstream effects, literally your process, the way you live and move in the world as a company can have all these impacts. And in a way, that's almost more important because I like to think that if you get that right, like if you get the internal stuff right, who you hire, how you hire them, how you treat them, you are far more likely to get all that other stuff right. Whereas if you're already, and this is another conversation that's going on in tech, if you are bad at being inclusive internally, if you're not making room to change as a company with the people you hire and letting them change you, and you're hiring for change rather than hiring for like culture fit or whatever, if you're bad at treating your employees well, the odds of you ever achieving truly inclusive design are nil, right? Because you're not going to be able to create something inclusive if you yourself are not inclusive. Like that is paddling uphill in the most astonishing way. And this is another important conversation. We talk about inclusive hiring practices where you see companies say, okay, we're going to hire more black people, and then all of a sudden the black people leave 6 months later because they hired them on the pretense that they would become white, right? Versus saying, hey, we're going to hire a bunch of people who don't look like us, and we hope you change us. We hope we are different 6 months from now, a year from now, because we hired you. That's a completely different approach, right? Growth mindset versus fixed mindset. So I think those are the real important changes to make as a company. And then you almost don't need me to come in and tell you how to do inclusive design because the odds you're going to stumble on it on your own just because you have a diverse workforce shoot up. And maybe I come in and I tell you, okay, now that you've got this diverse workforce, here's how to get the most out of the different, here's some techniques to go through some exercises to collaborate better. And I can tell you all about that. But those techniques work far better if you already have a diverse mindset and actual diverse workforce than if you're like, okay, teach us white guys how to be diverse. Like that just doesn't have as many legs.
Do you think that the move to more remote work has had an impact on diverse hiring?
I don't know.
Okay.
I think what it's had an impact on, and you should read a piece by Jill Ivey on this on Medium. She talks about this notion of like we need to redefine professionalism. But what I think it has an impact on is how we are allowed to be more human at work. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at me now like, before I went solo, this is how I showed up to meetings at work. Or currently how I show up to meetings, with clients. I might wear a nicer shirt, but right? But this is it. You're looking at a corner of our master bedroom, right? And there is a Eurocentric male energy that was defined as professionalism in the office. Wasn't super emotional, kind of buttoned up. maybe a little sexist, maybe. Um, and like don't be too human at work kind of thing. And it showed in the way we dressed, how we moved in that space, right? And we were all expected to more or less adhere to that. And it wasn't especially human. It was very functional, but it wasn't especially human. And it didn't allow for things like, hey, there was Trayvon Martin just died, and we expect our black employees to not be affected by that at all the next day. There wasn't a lot of room for that kind of emotionality, right? Emotions were considered, unless it was like male anger, emotions were considered bad. So I think what happened when we lived and worked out of our homes and showed up at work, quote unquote, in our lived environments with cats walking across the screen and kids yelling and like life, actual human life being in the office with us and everyone's human life appearing in this little grid in work meetings, it kind of took the piss out of that. It kind of said, yeah, we can get this shit done whether we're acting professional, quote unquote, or not. In fact, some of us can get it done a lot better. And two, like all the energy that went into that pretense might have been wasted. And it might be a good job to start to redefine how we're distributing that energy going forward, right? And what we're actually requiring as being professional or not. That was why the whole base camp thing couldn't have been more ill-timed. Like, you're going to decide after a year of working from home and having conversations from our homes that we can't talk about politics. After the year we've had, after the political year we've had, after the storming of the frickin' Capitol, you're going to say, oh yeah, by the way, don't talk about politics. Really? That's when you decide that's when it's important to have that conversation. It's like you could not have been more out of touch with where the puck was going. So, and again, I don't know where this goes. Again, fingers crossed, we start to rethink how much of our humanity, because the other thing I personally believe is that we are far more valuable when we are bringing our full selves to work.
Well, there's a Google study
when
that,
we try
that
to
played that out, proved that out. Right?
Yeah, it's so much more valuable. Like, I think part of the reason is because we're not investing so much emotional energy into putting on a facade, because that takes energy, right? But then B, I think our true selves are actually more valuable than our work selves. I think there's more creativity there. I think there's more freedom, more vitality. Like, I don't know. It gets very woo-woo very quick, but I think it's true. I think it's just true. And I think that we're suckered into this very industrial, like, you go to the factory, you build your part of the car, you go home. You go to the factory, you build your part of the car, you go home. Like, that mindset of what work is. And we bring that into these spaces where A, that's not really what the work is. And B, even if it were, I still think you'd do better if you were human. And I don't know. I think that there's so many interesting doors that have been opened and lies that have been made plain to be lies about what work is and should be. I would love to see us follow up on that. I would love to see us not just go back to, okay, we're in the office again, everybody put on your work face again. Yeah. I really hope that doesn't happen. But yeah, I think so all of us say no. I don't know that any of that has affected how inclusive hiring is, except to say I know a lot of places now are being agnostic about location. That can actually have a huge impact. And again, I don't know if it will, because I think it has to do with how they hire, but that can have a huge impact. Because I don't care where you work, okay, that opens up all sorts of things around the economics, right? It's like, oh, I can take that job in New York even if I can't afford to live in New York, right? Or I can live wherever I want. I can live where the cost of living is reasonable and still work at a company that's located in a place where the cost of living is not reasonable. That opens up stuff. That opens stuff a lot. Like, economic diversity is actually the toughest form of diversity to crack. Or I could be living in a neighborhood where people generally don't make that much because there's no jobs in the area, right? Versus saying, okay, now you're getting a salary right? And a whole bunch of people are getting salaries for jobs they're doing that aren't in that area, and suddenly they're bringing in money and raising the tax base for that area, even though the place that they're working technically isn't located specifically in that area, and is able to afford to pay them more. So that gets really interesting really quickly when you start thinking about how school policy is created and all. Like, there's all these net effects that could be interesting. Is it actually going to be interesting? I don't know. Is it actually interesting now? I don't know. But I would love to see it go there.
Well, I could say from a sample size of one, all the roles I've been hiring are all remote, and the pool of candidates is way more diverse than when I've just hired in Boston. And that may say something about the Boston community, but it's allowed us to interview and consider a much broader range of candidates.
See, I think that's great, and I think there's also a diversity, even regional diversity. Like, as flat as I make the white experience to be, the experience of some white dude living in Kansas is different than some white dude living in San Francisco. It just is, right? Even that level of diversity is more diversity than you've got right now.
You know, one thing I think it's also bringing out is some of these weird biases that some people have, which I hope they get, kind of shamed and going away. I'm thinking of one. I don't know if the woman was a recruiter or a coach, but she posted on LinkedIn that she was asked by one of her clients whether it was okay to take a drink during a Zoom interview, which seemed like an absurd question. And the person goes on to say that she did some of her research and she found that some people are bothered by seeing other people take a drink on camera, which seems to be the most ludicrous thing. Like, if you have this weird tick about seeing people drink on camera, fine, look, we all have our oddities. But if that's influencing your decision to hire someone, then you have an ethical problem.
Wait, now, just to be clear, drink alcohol?
No, like
or just
water.
Okay, because I'm like sitting here, I'm like, all right, I don't know if I'd feel great about seeing you have a beer during an interview, but
well, that'd be
that makes you a
different.
better worker.
Yeah.
I don't know,
That might be different.
Yeah, that's okay. So that's interesting too. Like, so I talk a lot in the book about different hiring practices and things that we know. I mean, there's it would be interesting actually to see how this plays out in remote hiring, right? Because there's studies that show when a white interviewer is interviewing a black applicant, they are more likely to sit further away and ask fewer questions. And I am really curious how that plays out online, right? Because the asking fewer questions thing can still happen, but the sitting further away, I wonder if do they back their chair up, right? Like, does that happen? I'm really curious now. But yeah, like I don't think that remote hiring is going to do much. That's why I was like not necessarily convinced that remote hiring was going to do anything about inclusive, because inclusive hiring practices have very little to do with, especially except for the part about location, which I think is huge, have very little to do with those kinds of interactions, because the patterns that hiring biases are feeding off of, right? Patterns that say that black men are more dangerous or less qualified, or that women are less qualified. Those patterns existed long before remote work, and they're unfortunately probably going to exist long after. And so I don't see remote hiring changing that dynamic very much. And I talk in the book about, like, anonymized hiring practices, which to some extent you can do, up to the point where you're actually seeing the person online. And I think there are definitely approaches around making sure that you're not just having one person talk to, or having the same type of person talk to the person. And there's also things you can do around. City of Philadelphia actually does some great work around this, about making sure that if we talk to one person virtually, we have to talk to everyone virtually, or making sure that there's people fill out their basically their notes, their opinions on the person before they talk to anybody else. Like, there's a lot of just little touches that you can do to make it more scientific, basically. But at the end of the day, if you got the pattern, you got the pattern, and I need you to not have the pattern. And until you don't have the pattern, I need these other things in place too. So maybe you do have a thing about watching people drink water online. I can't control for that. What I can do is say, okay, but the next person who talks to that person, I need someone else to talk to that person who doesn't have a thing about drinking water online. Maybe there are things about eating online. I don't know, but like I can't rest everything on you, because I don't care who you are. You are going to have some bias that is going to give somebody in the list of people you're talking to an edge, right? And I have to figure out how to make sure that I am mitigating that. And again, I don't want to. I find it more valuable. This is something else we do in the workshop, actually. We talk a lot about how information can be biasing because it's unnecessary. And we actually go through a resume and we sort of try to take out every piece of information that we think could be biasing. And by the end of that exercise, most people have almost nothing left. Like the typical LinkedIn page has so much information that is actually super biasing. And at the end of that, it's really becomes this discussion about saying, okay, let's do the opposite version. And instead of saying, what would you take away from this resume? Let's start with a blank piece of paper. What do you need to know about this person before you decide to hire them, or at least decide to interview them? And maybe you're actually making a form that has like 3-4 questions on it tops, because there's not that much that you really, really need. Or maybe the stuff you need isn't the stuff we typically ask for, right? What does that look like? I think that's a much more interesting discussion and much more fruitful. And again, leads to completely overhauling a broken system, so be it. But I think that's kind of where you end up going with the whole like trying to create a more equitable like hiring approach.
David, I know we've taken up a lot of your time. I really appreciate it. Before we wrap up, I'm just curious, what's next? Is there anything that you're working on kind of in development or concepts you're thinking about that you'd be interested in sharing?
Yeah, so for the time being, I am focused on, like I said, I got this new business. I am doing talks, giving workshops. Hire me now, but and trying to like get those as buttoned up as possible. Long term, I'm trying to think about other audiences. Frankly, I'm trying to think about like I increasingly find myself working with leaders, people who are in leadership positions, and I'm trying to sort of put together some material that really helps you be a bias informed leader. I think that the importance of good leadership, I think, is becoming extremely apparent. So I'm trying to find the material that can really help with that. So whether that's a new talk or whether that's a new workshop, I don't know, but that's something I'm really trying to develop now. And super long term, I don't know if you know this, but I am a filmmaker at heart. I've been making movies ever since I was a kid. So I want to kind of get back to that. So I'm going to be working on a screenplay, a horror screenplay actually, sort of a social justice horror genre. But so that's something I'm going to be working on long term. But yeah, that's kind of what's taken up my bandwidth lately.
Sounds awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for joining me today. If people want to hear more from you, or they want to learn more about what you offer, where can they find you online?
DavidDylanThomas.com. That's got my newsletter. That's got all the different offerings I have as a speaker and workshop guy. And or if you just want to like get in touch, there's a little contact me button there too. So yeah, check it out, DavidDylanThomas.com.
Awesome. Well, also be sure to check out David's book, Design for Cognitive Bias. Even if you think you know a lot about cognitive bias, you're still going to learn a lot from it. I really enjoyed the book. It was fantastic. I'll put links to that and all the other things we've talked about in the show notes, which will be up at www.sux.live. That's SUX for Saving UX. And before you go, I think it'd be great to think about one thing you heard today that you want to try and incorporate into your work. Make a plan for it when you want to try it, and just let that be your next experiment. Would love to hear how it goes. You can always tweet to @Sonarc, SONARC, that's me, with your story, and I look forward to hearing it. With that, again, just one more thank you to David Dylan Thomas, and we'll see everyone next episode.